The crowd gathered on the cold plain outside Clermont in November 1095 did not yet know that it was standing at the threshold of centuries of bloodshed, but it felt the tremor all the same. When Pope Urban II raised his voice on the final day of the Council of Clermont, speaking not in the Latin of canon law, but in the vernacular rhythms of lived belief, he described the suffering of Eastern Christians and the desecration of holy places with words carefully chosen to ignite the imagination of ordinary people. Chroniclers, such as Fulcher of Chartres and Robert the Monk, both present or writing shortly after, recorded that peasants wept, knights shouted, and the cry Dies Vult rolled across the field like a physical force. This was not an army assembled by feudal summons alone. It was a psychological mobilization, sanctioned by papal authority and embedded in theology, that transformed farmers, artisans, and minor nobles into instruments of sacred violence. At the end of the 11th century, Western Europe was a society structured by faith as much as by land. The Gregorian reform, formalized under Pope Gregory VII in the 1070s, had sharpened the Church's claim to moral authority over both clergy and laity. Canon law collections, such as the Dictatus Papae of 1075, asserted papal supremacy, while sermons and penitential manuals increasingly emphasized sin, confession, and the afterlife. In this world, the promise Urban II made at Clermont, recorded explicitly by Fulcher of Chartres, was radical and precise. Those who went to Jerusalem for the liberation of the Church would receive a plenary indulgence, the full remission of temporal punishment for sins. If you care about hidden history, the real cost of power, and how fear and humiliation were used as tools of control, subscribe to the channel. Here we tell history without comfort or myths, give voice to those who were meant to be silenced, and uncover what textbooks often avoid. Subscribing helps keep these stories from disappearing again. For a peasant accustomed to fearing purgatory more than hunger, this was a moral transaction of staggering power. Within months, the so-called People's Crusade began to move. Led by figures like Peter the Hermit, whose preaching is documented by Albert of Aachen, thousands of untrained civilians left their villages in the spring of 1096. They sold tools, abandoned fields, and marched eastward carrying crosses stitched to their clothes. These were not professional soldiers. Many had never traveled beyond their local market towns. Yet along the Rhine, groups associated with Count Amico of Leiningen attacked Jewish communities in Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. Hebrew chronicles, such as the Mainz Anonymous and Solomon Bar Simpson, describe the massacres with grief-stricken clarity, while imperial charters show that bishops like John of Speyer attempted, and failed, to protect Jewish residents. The violence was not commanded directly by Urban II, but it emerged logically from a system that framed the world as a cosmic struggle between the saved and the damned. A struggle in which ordinary believers were told they had a role to play. By July 1099, when the crusading armies reached Jerusalem, the psychological transformation was complete. Raymond of Aguilar's, chaplain to Count Raymond IV of Toulouse, wrote that the capture of the city was seen as divine vindication. Latin chronicles report mass killings of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, framed not as crimes, but as acts of purification. The crucial detail is not the brutality itself, which has often been described, but the identity of the perpetrators. Many were not knights bound by chivalric codes, but foot soldiers, camp followers, and pilgrims who believed that violence performed under sacred authorization was no longer sin but service. The Church did not merely bless the war, it provided a moral architecture in which cruelty could be reinterpreted as obedience. As the 12th and 13th centuries progressed, this mechanism of mobilization became institutionalized. Papal bulls, such as Quantum Predecessors, issued by Pope Eugenius III in 1145, and Ad Liberandum promulgated by Pope Innocent III at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, extended crusading privileges to new theaters. The promise of indulgence, protection of property, and legal immunity applied not only to expeditions to the Holy Land, but also to campaigns within Europe. The Albigensian Crusade, launched in 1209 against Cathar heresy in southern France, is a stark example. When papal legate Arnaud Amalric reportedly answered, "Kill them all. God will know his own." During the sack of Béziers, as recorded by Caesarius of Heisterbach, the phrase captured the terrifying logic of ideological certainty. Town militias and local levies participated alongside northern French nobles, convinced that extermination of heresy was a communal duty. This pattern repeated itself in the Baltic. Beginning in the early 13th century, Papal bulls, such as Innocent III et 1199 letter, Cum nobis peditor, encouraged crusades against pagan peoples of northeastern Europe. The Teutonic Order, formally recognized by Pope Innocent III in 1199 and militarized in Prussia after 1226 under the Golden Bull of Rimini issued by Emperor Frederick II, relied heavily on settlers, merchants, and volunteers from German towns. These men were not born warriors. Town records from Lübeck and Bremen list artisans who joined seasonal campaigns against Prussians and Lithuanians, drawn by promises of land, remission of sins, and participation in a sacred enterprise. Chroniclers like Peter of Duisburg framed these wars as battles between light and darkness, simplifying complex cultural encounters into moral absolutes that justified forced conversion and mass death. While crusading ideology expanded outward, the same psychological tools were turned inward. The medieval Inquisition, institutionalized by Pope Gregory IX in 1231 through the Bull Excommunicamus, did not operate as a distant terror imposed solely by clerical elites. It functioned through local participation. Manuals, such as Bernard Gui's Practica Inquisitionis Heredis Previtatis, written around 1324, instructed inquisitors to rely on denunciations from neighbors and kin. Ordinary people were encouraged, and sometimes compelled, to testify against those suspected of heresy. Fear of association and the desire to demonstrate orthodoxy created a climate in which silence became dangerous. In towns across Languedoc and northern Italy, civic records show citizens attending inquisitorial sermons where the names of the accused were read aloud. Public penance, the wearing of crosses or badges, and confiscation of property were communal spectacles. While executions occurred, the more pervasive mechanism was social annihilation. A man reconciled to the church after confessing heresy might live, but his reputation was destroyed, his family marked, and his economic survival compromised. This system relied on the cooperation of ordinary people who enforced boundaries through gossip, exclusion, and public shaming, believing they were protecting the moral health of the community. The late Middle Ages intensified these dynamics rather than softening them. In 15th century Spain, long before the formal establishment of the Spanish Inquisition in 1478 by Pope Sixtus IV Bull Exigit Censori Devotionis Effectus, popular violence against conversos erupted in cities such as Toledo and Seville. Municipal records from the 1440s document riots led by artisans and apprentices who accused converts of secret Jewish practices. When Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile created a royal inquisition, they did not invent the hostility. They systematized it. Autos de fe, first held in Seville in 1481, were public rituals that required the presence of entire communities. The punishment was often humiliation rather than death, but the participation of neighbors as witnesses transformed ideological conformity into a collective project. The legal framework that supported this participation was precise. Inquisitorial registers preserved in the Archivo Historico Nacional reveal that accusations frequently originated from personal disputes. A quarrel over a debt or a marriage could be reframed as suspicion of heresy. Ordinary people learned quickly that aligning with institutional power offered protection. By denouncing others, they demonstrated loyalty. This is the core psychological mechanism at work, fear combined with reward, creating a system where cruelty was not only permitted, but incentivized. The Black Death of the mid-14th century added another layer. As plague devastated Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing an estimated one-third of the population, panic sought explanation. Papal letters from Clement VI attempted to defend Jewish communities, but rumors of well poisoning spread among the populace. Town councils from Basel to Strasbourg recorded executions of Jews, carried out by civic authorities under pressure from citizens. Here again, ordinary people acted as agents of violence, driven by fear of divine punishment and the belief that eliminating a perceived enemy could restore cosmic order. By the time Martin Luther challenged papal authority in 1517, posting his 95 Theses in Wittenberg, the machinery of religious mobilization was deeply ingrained. The Reformation did not end the pattern, it replicated it in new forms. During the German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525, preachers such as Thomas Müntzer invoked scripture to justify rebellion, while Luther himself later urged princes to suppress the peasants violently, calling them mad dogs. Pamphlets circulated widely thanks to the printing press, spreading apocalyptic language that framed conflict as divinely sanctioned. tens of thousands of peasants, armed with farm tools, died believing they were participants in sacred history. Throughout these centuries, the common thread is not blind obedience, but structured belief. The Church and allied authorities provided narratives that explained suffering, promised reward, and defined enemies. Ordinary people, living in precarious conditions and taught from childhood that eternal salvation outweighed earthly life, internalized these narratives. When violence came, it felt not like transgression, but like fulfillment of duty. The archival record makes this clear in its banality. Account books list payments for ropes and scaffolds. Parish registers note absences where families once stood. Letters from bishops thank towns for their zeal. None of these documents speak the language of madness. They speak the language of order. That is the most unsettling truth. The cruelty of the late Middle Ages was not driven solely by tyrants or fanatics. It was sustained by neighbors, co-workers, and relatives who believed that participating in sanctioned violence was the price of belonging. As the medieval world edged toward the early modern period, skepticism slowly grew, but the psychological blueprint remained. Ideology, when fused with fear and reward, could still turn civilians into executioners and witnesses into accomplices. The story is not one of monsters emerging from nowhere. It is the story of ordinary people acting within systems that taught them that mercy was weakness and obedience was virtue. The bells that rang at Clermont, Jerusalem, Béziers, and Seville were not only calls to prayer. They were signals that the boundaries of moral action had shifted, and that under the right conditions, cruelty could feel like faith.